Hey, this will be our video for Chapter 0. That's our 6th grade review stuff. And this is Lesson 1, which is just comparing and ordering decimals. This is a pretty basic review lesson, shouldn't take us very long to get through. Please follow along in your notes, and remember you can pause the video at any time to do some of your own practice problems. So our very first set of notes, they're a little bit of vocab here. Just remember ascending is a word that means when we order from least to greatest. Other words that mean the same thing as ascending are increasing or going up. An example of ascending numbers would be 5, 9, 11, 17, 22, 27. So this is kind of how we order numbers by default. We want to put them from least to greatest. That's kind of how we've been taught. The opposite of ascending is called descending. Now descending, if ascending is least to greatest, then descending is greatest to least. So synonyms for the word descending would be decreasing or going down, and you see an example of a list of numbers in decreasing or descending order. You want to pay attention for these words. A lot of times students will put numbers in ascending order automatically because it is so common for us. So just watch out to make sure they're not asking for descending instead. You don't want to lose points for something just because you didn't read carefully. So talking about decimals, that means that we need to review place value very, very quickly. And place value is really important that we understand it, that we remember it, that we read numbers using correct place value. So here's a really quick place value chart that I drew up. Remember your decimal point, that would be right there in the middle. And then we read numbers according to the greatest place value over here on the whole number side, and we read the number according to the smallest place value over here on the decimal side. So let's look at a practice number, and we're going to make it pretty challenging. Let's go with 5, 6, 8, 392.2164. Okay, so the first thing that I like to do is I go over here to my whole number side and I put in my commas. Remember 1, 2, 3, put your comma in like that. And then 1, 2, 3, we do not need a comma in front of the 5. So when we start reading this, we will read 568,392. Once we get to the decimal, we read the word and. Okay, that's the only time in reading numbers that we actually say the word and with a decimal or when we break a mixed number into a whole number and fraction part. So be careful with how often you say and. We really only say it when there's a decimal involved. Okay, so we have our 568,392, and now we can kind of stop, ignore the first half of numbers, and focus on our second half. So here's what I like to do. I cover up the decimal, I cover up this piece here with my hand, and then I read this number as if it were a whole number. 2,164. 2,164. Then you have to read the place value of the 4. That's our 10,000ths spot. Okay, so if I'm just reading the decimal portion, that would be 2,164 10,000ths. If I read the whole number itself, get ready, it is 568,392 and 2,164 10,000ths. So you may want to take a look at this chart. You may want to practice a couple numbers yourself. I'm going to clear out our number here. If you want to pause the video, if you want to put some numbers in its place and try reading them, but place value will be incredibly important to us this school year. Okay, moving on, a couple more notes here. You'll find these in your note packet. More notes. It says, when ordering decimals, we are going to add zeros after the decimal to make the numbers the same length. Not only does it make them the same length, but it lines up their place values. So I'm going to show you two different ways to compare these two numbers. You can choose the way that you like, and I would stick with it. Be consistent so that you know how to do this all the time correctly, quickly, because this is an important skill for us to have. So we've got two numbers here, 4.77, so that's 4 and 77 hundredths. We also have 4.709, that's 4 and 709 thousandths. So our two numbers are not the same length, they're not the same place value. So I want to make them the same length. I'm going to add a 0 on to my first number. Now we've got the same place value going on. So a couple different ways to do this. One way is going just digit by digit. In the ones place, we've got a 4 and a 4. They're the same number, so I move to the tenths place. We've got a 7 and a 7. They're the same digit, so I can move to the hundredths place. In my hundredths place, I have a 7 here. I have a 0 here. Well, 7 is greater than 0, so that must mean that my first number is greater than my second number. So that's one way to do this, digit by digit, place value by place value. I'm going to clear off my work here, and I'm going to show you a different way to do this. Okay, I'm going to put my 0 back in here. The other way to get the job done here would be to, since my whole numbers are the same, I'm going to focus on the decimal part. And my decimal part here is 770. That's 770 thousandths. My decimal part here is 709. That's 709 thousandths. So we're just showing this in a different representation, looking at it as fractions. And you remember comparing fractions, we would have our common denominators, so all we have to do is look at the numerators, and we know that 770 is a larger number than 709. So that tells me that 4 and 77 hundredths is greater than 4 and 709 thousandths. So there's two different ways for you to do this skill. If you have a different way, let's talk about it. Come see me. Maybe it's something that we can show the class, but be consistent. Make sure you master your skill. Okay? One more note. When ordering negative numbers can be tricky sometimes. Remember, the smaller number is the one that is farther away from 0 on the number line. So here we are asked to compare -5 and -9. Here is my number line. 0 is my focal point there. Okay, 0 is my big important number. If it's farther away from 0 on the number line, we know it is the smaller number. If it's closer to 0, we know it is the larger number. So let's plot them. -5 is right here. -9 is farther down the number line. So that tells me that -9 is the smaller of the two numbers, the smaller of the two. Another thing that I like to keep in the back of my head is I say with negatives, if it looks bigger, it's actually smaller. Negative kind of takes our rules and flips them upside down. So take a look at our number line, practice that, practice writing your number line. They can come in very handy as well. One last problem, this is not in your notes, so just pay attention. We have a list of 5 numbers, and they're asking us to put them in ascending order. Remember, ascending means least to greatest. So when we put them in ascending order, we want to make sure that the smallest numbers come first and the highest numbers are at the end of the list. So when I have a list like this and I've got some negatives and some positives, I really want to focus on the negatives first. I know my negatives are going to be the smallest numbers. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of put a box around those two numbers. We'll focus on them first. So -5 and 8/10 and -5 and 85 hundredths. They are not the same length, so I'm going to add a 0 to my first number to make them the same length, same place value, and then I can start comparing them. Remember, with negatives, the one that is farther away from 0 is going to be the smaller of the two. The one that looks bigger is actually smaller. So what looks bigger, an 80 or an 85? An 85 looks bigger. That means it's going to be plotted farther down the number line. That means that is my smaller number. That takes some practice, practice getting used to that. So that's my smaller number. Negative 5 and 8/10 is the larger of my two negative numbers, and now I can keep going through my list. I look at 0, 2.9, and 2.19. Well, we know that 0 is the middle of the negatives and the positives, so 0 is going to come next. And now I can focus on comparing these two numbers, 2 and 9/10 and 2 and 19/100. So there's my 2 and 9/10, 2 and 19/100. I'm going to add the 0 to make my decimals the same length. Now I look at a 90 and a 19. What's bigger? A 90 is bigger than a 19. So 2 and 19/100 will come next, and my greatest number is 2 and 9/10. Now keep in mind one big thing in your final answer. Your final answer should match up with the original numbers. So even though I added a 0 here, I got rid of it in my final answer. I added a 0 here and I got rid of it in my final answer. So make sure that your final answers are in final answer form. They should use the original numbers. All right, that's it. Go do some practice.